dive into the explosive clash where Hollywood arrogance meets military honor head-on. Like, subscribe, and comment below to witness how truth and respect take center stage in Caroline Now's most unforgettable showdown yet. The Dolby Theater gleamed with the artificial light of 1,000 camera flashes, each one capturing the carefully curated smiles of America's entertainment elite. Among the procession of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, White House Press Secretary Caroline Levit moved with measured confidence, her arm linked with that of her husband, Daniel Whitmore. Cal Morgan narrating, "In the cathedral of celebrity worship, Caroline and Daniel represented something foreign, something authentic. The cameras lingered on them, not for their clothing or cosmetic enhancements, but for the incongruity they presented." Daniel's posture betrayed his military background, a Marine whose silent dignity seemed almost revolutionary amidst the pageantry. His eyes, which had witnessed combat zones across 3 continents, now surveyed the theater with the same vigilant composure. The medals he'd earned remained at home, but the scars, visible and invisible, accompanied him down the red carpet. As they took their seats, whispers followed. The press corps, accustomed to Caroline's unflinching defensive policy at the podium, found themselves captivated by this glimpse into her personal world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom Cruz's voice reverberated through the hall as he took command of the stage, his trademark smile gleaming with practiced precision. "Tonight we celebrate storytelling, though some of us tell better stories than others." Laughter rippled predictably through the audience. "I see we have the White House press secretary with us tonight, Caroline Levit, accompanied by her husband, who I understand served in the Marines." A smattering of respectful applause began, but was quickly severed as Cruz continued. "I guess she needed someone who's experienced at taking orders and repeating lines without question." The theater temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Some laughed nervously, others shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's expression remained unchanged, a testament to discipline forged in environments far more hostile than this. But Caroline's eyes registered something the cameras caught in high-definition close-up. It wasn't embarrassment or shock, but rather the crystallization of resolve. Those who had faced her in the White House briefing room recognized it immediately, the look that preceded a devastating counteroffensive. She smiled politely, her hand finding Daniel's in a gesture both intimate and public. The moment passed as Cruz pivoted to his next target, unaware that he had just ignited a fuse that would soon detonate with precision. As the evening continued, Caroline maintained her diplomatic veneer, exchanging pleasantries and deflecting questions with practiced ease. But those who knew her best recognized that beneath the social choreography, something had fundamentally changed. The woman who had navigated international crises and hostile press corps was now calculating a response to this personal affront with the same methodical intensity. The awards would be distributed, speeches would be made, champagne would flow, but an invisible clock had started ticking. Hollywood's carefully constructed hierarchy was about to face a challenge from someone who understood both the power of words and the weight of honor. And unlike the scripted dramas being celebrated that night, no one had prepared the ending to this particular confrontation. Backstage at the Dolby Theater, Tom Cruz continued his performance long after leaving the spotlight. Surrounded by his entourage, he basked in the afterglow of laughter his jab at Daniel Whitmore had elicited. Cal Morgan narrating, "The hierarchy of celebrity culture operates on unspoken rules. Who speaks, who listens, and most importantly, who remains silent when mocked." Caroline Levit was about to shatter those conventions with surgical precision. Caroline's eyes narrowed as she listened to Cruz's voice carrying through the backstage monitors, doubling down on his earlier joke, with even more pointed commentary about military types who can't take a joke. Her diplomatic restraint, honed through countless White House briefings, reached its breaking point. Without a word to the handlers anxiously tracking her movements, Caroline broke from the predetermined path of guest seating and moved with unwavering purpose toward the stage wings. A production assistant stepped forward, clipboard raised like a fragile shield. "Mrs. Levit, you're not scheduled until..." Caroline moved past him, with the same efficiency she used to navigate between hostile questions in the press room. The awards segment concluded, and as Cruz prepared to introduce the next presenter, Caroline stepped into the light. The audience's confused murmur rippled across the theater as Cruz turned, his practiced smile faltering momentarily before reassembling itself. "Well, this is unexpected," he quipped, attempting to reclaim control of the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, apparently the White House wishes equal time. Scattered laughter died as Caroline reached the microphone. Her voice, stripped of its usual political cushioning, cut through the acoustic perfection of the theater. "I've spent my career parsing words carefully," she began, her tone measured yet unnervingly direct. "Tonight I'm speaking not as press secretary, but as the wife of a man who has given more to this country than most in this room could comprehend." The cameras, now frantically reorienting to capture this unscripted confrontation, found Daniel standing at the theater's edge, his posture military straight, his expression betraying nothing. "My husband survived 3 tours in combat zones while some here were complaining about trailer accommodations," Caroline continued, her gaze steady on Cruz. "He's removed shrapnel from his body while others were removing negative reviews from their press packets." The theater had transformed. What began as entertainment was now something rawer, more authentic. Several veterans in the audience straightened visibly, their attention absolute. Cruz attempted to interject with rehearsed charm, but Caroline's command of the moment proved superior. "I've dealt with dictators threatening nuclear war who showed more respect for service than what I witnessed tonight," she said, each word landing with precision. From his position near the backstage entrance, Keanu Reeves, known for his quiet support of veterans' causes, nodded slowly, his silent endorsement noticed by those nearby. As Caroline finished, she didn't storm off or make a dramatic exit. Instead, she thanked the audience with the same poised professionalism she brought to the White House briefing room and walked deliberately back to her seat. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. It lasted 3 seconds before someone, later identified as a sound technician who'd served in the Air Force, began to applaud. The applause spread like wildfire. Cruz remained on stage, his typical dominance of the room evaporated. His smile now seemed plasticized, a poor disguise for the calculation behind his eyes, as he assessed the damage to his carefully crafted public image. In the theater's shadows, Tucker Green made notes on his phone, recognizing the contours of a story that would dominate his network by morning. This wasn't merely celebrity drama, it was the collision of America's parallel value systems playing out under hot lights. Daniel met Caroline at their seats, their brief exchange of glances communicating volumes. This was only the beginning. Cruz's team was already huddled in frantic damage control, and the social media storm was building with each passing second. But in that moment, as the show awkwardly lurched back toward its scheduled programming, one thing was undeniable. Caroline Levit had changed the narrative, transforming an evening of self-celebration into something that felt surprisingly like accountability. The morning after Caroline's backstage confrontation, America awoke to a media landscape transformed. The award show moment had metamorphosed overnight into something larger, a cultural inflection point where celebrity privilege collided with military honor. Cal Morgan narrating, "What Tom Cruise failed to understand was the fundamental asymmetry of power he had disturbed. Some fights aren't measured by wealth or fame, but by the weight of sacrifice that stands behind them." Daniel Whitmore was about to demonstrate this with devastating clarity. Cruz's legal team had already dispatched cease-and-desist letters to major networks, threatening litigation against anyone who continued airing Caroline's unscripted intervention. The strategy was familiar: overwhelming force applied through expensive attorneys to maintain narrative control. What they hadn't accounted for was Tucker Green's invitation. Fox News had extended an opportunity for Caroline to address the escalating situation. What they received instead was Daniel himself, the decorated Marine who had remained stoically silent throughout the public spectacle. "We're joined by Daniel Whitmore, husband of White House Press Secretary Caroline Levit," Green began, his introduction deliberately stripped of theatrical flourish. "Thank you for being here." Daniel sat with the contained composure of a man accustomed to operating under pressure. His voice, when it came, carried the unmistakable cadence of command without raising a decibel. "I've never sought the spotlight," Daniel began, "but when my service becomes a punchline for people who've never witnessed the cost of freedom, I believe clarity becomes necessary." The studio grew unnaturally still as Daniel methodically dismantled Cruz's mockery. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. Mr. Cruz once played a naval aviator and somehow believes this grants him insight into military service. "I've carried friends from battlefields. I've written letters to their families. I've honored their sacrifices by continuing to serve my country without seeking applause." The calm precision of Daniel's words carried an authority no screenplay could manufacture. There was something mesmerizing about his restraint. The disciplined absence of histrionics made each statement land with seismic impact. "My wife defended something larger than me," Daniel continued. "She defended the proposition that sacrifice deserves respect, not mockery. That proposition shouldn't be controversial, yet here we are." Within minutes, the interview fragment detonated across social media platforms. Hashtag Daniel Whitmore and hashtag Respect No Ridicule began trending nationally. What had been Cruz's attempt to score cheap laughs had transformed into a moment of national reflection on the chasm between celebrity and service. Perhaps most damaging to Cruz's position was the unexpected alliance forming in response. Keanu Reeves, breaking his characteristic privacy, released a simple statement. "I stand with Daniel Whitmore and all who serve. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, even in jest." Other veterans in Hollywood began speaking out, not with the manufactured outrage that typically fuels news cycles, but with measured assessments that carried the weight of personal experience. The narrative was slipping irretrievably from Cruz's control. As cable news dissected the cultural implications, Daniel and Caroline declined further comment. They didn't need to fuel the fire they'd ignited. The conversation had evolved beyond personalities into something more substantive, a nationwide examination of how America treats its service members versus its celebrities. Cruz's publicist released a carefully crafted apology by mid-afternoon, but it rang hollow against Daniel's authentic dignity. The damage control efforts only highlighted the fundamental disconnect: prepared statements versus lived experience. In Washington's power corridors, a subtle shift occurred. Partisan divisions temporarily dissolved as lawmakers from both parties recognized the political liability of appearing to side against Daniel's understated patriotism. Some battles transcend the usual tribal lines. By evening, what had begun as celebrity drama had crystallized into something else entirely. A moment when substance silenced spectacle. When the quiet authority of service overwhelmed the manufactured authority of fame. The lesson wasn't lost on the American public. True power doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It demonstrates itself with dignity, even when, especially when, challenged by those who mistake visibility for significance. Tom Cruz's legal team struck with the predictable fury of wounded celebrity ego. Cease and desist letters flooded newsrooms, threatening ruinous litigation against anyone perpetuating what they called slanderous attacks on their client's character. Cal Morgan narrating. Cruz had deployed the oldest weapon in the celebrity arsenal, legal intimidation, but Caroline Levit wasn't navigating a Hollywood script. She was operating in a realm where truth, not theatrics, determined the final act. When Caroline received her own hand-delivered threat of defamation proceedings, something shifted in her tactical approach. The White House press secretary had spent years deflecting partisan attacks with professional detachment. This was different. This was personal. Tucker Green's primetime interview slot provided the perfect battlefield. The Fox host's introduction was deliberately measured. "Tonight, we speak with White House Press Secretary Caroline Levit regarding recent allegations and counter-allegations involving Tom Cruise." Caroline appeared immaculate in a navy suit, her composure unruffled by the storm surrounding her. But tonight, she carried something unusual: a small flash drive placed deliberately beside her microphone as cameras rolled. "Tucker, I understand Mr. Cruz believes I've damaged his reputation," Caroline began, her voice carrying the measured cadence that had become her trademark in briefing rooms. "But I'm a public servant married to a Marine. We deal in facts, not intimidation." The flash drive between them suddenly became the focal point of millions watching. This contains emails and organizational records from veterans forward, dating back to 2019. Caroline continued. Mr. Cruz committed to headline their annual fundraiser, an event that would secure operational funding for veteran mental health initiatives across 5 states. Her fingers brushed the drive with deliberate precision. 2 hours before the event, Mr. Cruz's team informed organizers he would not attend because, I quote directly from his assistant's email, "scheduling conflicts have arisen with a more pressing opportunity." The studio grew unnaturally still. That more pressing opportunity was a yacht party in Cannes, well documented on social media. The veterans event had to be canceled. Donations were returned. Programs were cut. The revelation landed with devastating effect. not through emotional hyperbole, but through the methodical presentation of evidence. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't spin. Mr. Cruz has threatened legal action, Caroline said, her composure unwavering. I welcome it. Discovery would be illuminating. Within minutes, #FlashDriveTruth and #CruzExposed began trending nationwide. The legal threat, intended to silence, had instead amplified the story beyond containment. More remarkable was the unprecedented coalition forming in response. Keanu Reeves, having already voiced support for Daniel, released footage of himself at that very veterans fundraiser, volunteering quietly after the cancellation crisis. Some of us show up, was his only comment. Across Hollywood, a fracture line appeared. Those with authentic connections to military service or charitable commitments aligned with Caroline, while others maintained strategic silence, recognizing the shifting cultural terrain. Veterans organizations began releasing statements confirming Caroline's account. Military families shared stories of actual scheduling conflicts overcome through commitment rather than abandoned for convenience. The most devastating response came not from celebrities or politicians, but from Daniel Whitmore's former unit members, Marines who appeared in an unpolished video testimonial, standing shoulder to shoulder. We don't need actors pretending to understand sacrifice, their elected spokesperson stated. We need Americans who recognize it. Cruz's legal team quietly withdrew their threats as the evidence mounted. A hastily arranged donation to veterans' charities appeared transparently reactionary rather than genuinely remorseful. The confrontation had transcended individual personalities. It had become a moment of national reflection on substance versus performance, on commitment versus convenience, on respect earned rather than demanded. As Daniel and Caroline attended a previously scheduled veterans hospital visit, cameras conspicuously absent at their request, America witnessed the fundamental difference between service conducted for attention and service as a way of life. In Washington and Hollywood alike, power brokers observed a rarely acknowledged truth. Some battles can't be won with money, fame, or legal maneuvers. Some forces, once unleashed, reveal the emperor's new clothes for what they truly are, elaborate illusions that dissolve when confronted with authentic integrity. Cal Morgan narrating. The battlefield had shifted. No longer confined to newsrooms or briefing podiums, the confrontation between White House Press Secretary Caroline Levit and Hollywood icon Tom Cruz had expanded to the court of public opinion, where evidence, not celebrity, would determine the victor. Caroline's methodical approach proved devastatingly effective. The flash drive that had sat so deliberately on Tucker Green's desk became the digital equivalent of a precision strike. Within hours, its contents were meticulously unpacked across social platforms, emails, timestamps, corroborating testimonials from veterans organizations, all forming an irrefutable cascade of truth. The evidence package assembled by Caroline Levit wasn't merely defensive, observed media analysts. It was a masterclass in substantive counter-programming against celebrity damage control. A particularly damning video compilation juxtaposed Cruz's public statements about supporting veterans against footage from the Cannes yacht party that had superseded his commitment. The timestamp overlay proved particularly devastating, showing him sipping champagne precisely when he had been scheduled to address families who had lost loved ones in combat. Perhaps most remarkable was the groundswell of Hollywood figures breaking ranks. Keanu Reeves, having initially voiced support for Daniel Whitmore, now stepped fully into the fray. I've worked with Tom, Reeves stated in a quietly powerful interview, but I've also worked alongside veterans. Only one group consistently shows up when they say they will. As the evidence mounted, even initially, skeptical media figures began acknowledging the substance behind Caroline's claims. Primetime hosts who had framed the confrontation as political theater now devoted segments to discussing the broader implications of accountability versus celebrity exemption. Cruz's formidable PR machine, which had initially flooded newsrooms with cease and desist letters, fell conspicuously silent. His legal team's withdrawal of lawsuit threats spoke volumes in its quiet admission of defeat. When a celebrity lawyer retreats without comment, noted one legal analyst, it's the clearest acknowledgement that discovery proceedings would prove more damaging than any potential victory. The most telling development came not through public statements but through absence. Cruz, typically ubiquitous when promoting projects, disappeared from scheduled appearances. His sudden social media hiatus, officially attributed to filming commitments, signaled the strategic retreat of a campaign that had miscalculated its opponent. For Caroline and Daniel, victory manifested not in celebration, but in resuming their normal lives with quiet dignity. They were photographed volunteering at a veterans rehabilitation center, not as a photo opportunity, but captured by others present who recognized the stark contrast between performed charity and lived commitment. "We're just doing what we've always done," Daniel responded when approached by reporters. "Service isn't exceptional, it's expected." In Washington circles, the resolution represented something more profound than a personal vindication. It demonstrated how authentic integrity, when backed by incontrovertible evidence, could neutralize even the most privileged forms of celebrity influence. As one political strategist observed, Caroline Levit didn't just win a PR battle, she reset the entire relationship between political accountability and entertainment influence. The most revealing aspect of the resolution wasn't what was said, but what remained conspicuously unspoken. Cruz never addressed the substantive claims, never refuted the evidence, never acknowledged the veterans affected by his choices. His silence became the final punctuation mark on a narrative no longer under his control. In a media landscape accustomed to celebrity power plays and hollow apologies, the outcome proved unexpectedly definitive. Truth, methodically presented and unapologetically defended, had accomplished what no amount of spin could counter. Hollywood bravado had collided with military honor, and for once, substance had prevailed over star power. Cal Morgan narrating, "The Veterans Honor Summit stood as hallowed ground, a place where words carried weight beyond political calculation." Caroline Levit took the stage not as a press secretary, but as the wife of a Marine, the defender of a truth larger than any Hollywood narrative could contain. The auditorium fell silent as she approached the podium. Her notes remained folded in her pocket, unnecessary for what needed to be said. The battle with Tom Cruz had dominated headlines, but this moment transcended that conflict entirely. "I'm not here to continue a public disagreement," Caroline began, her voice steady, with the quiet authority that commands more respect than shouting ever could. "I stand before you to celebrate something far more enduring, the bonds of honor, faith, and commitment that unite every military family across this nation." The cameras that had once framed her as merely a political operative now captured something more compelling, authentic leadership distilled to its essence. In the third row, Daniel Whitmore watched, the rigid posture of a Marine softening with unmistakable pride. "What we've witnessed these past weeks isn't unique to my family," Caroline continued. "Every service member knows the weight of showing up when called. Every military family understands sacrifice isn't selective. It's a daily commitment to something larger than ourselves." Her words resonated because they weren't crafted for viral moments or political advantage. They emerged from lived experience, the midnight worries, the pride that transcends partisanship, the understanding that some commitments are sacred. In the audience, veterans of conflicts spanning decades nodded in recognition. This wasn't political theater, it was acknowledgement of a shared covenant that existed long before cameras and would endure long after headlines faded. "Leadership isn't measured by who speaks loudest or enjoys the brightest spotlight," she said, the summit's massive American flag hanging still behind her. "It's measured by the quiet reliability of showing up, standing firm, and serving with consistent dignity, especially when no one's watching." The statement hung in the air, an unmistakable contrast to Cruz's carefully curated public persona, yet Caroline never needed to mention his name. The truth, once fully illuminated, required no further emphasis. Keanu Reeves, seated among veterans rather than in celebrity-reserved seating, was among the first to rise as she concluded. One by one, the audience followed military families, policymakers, citizens who recognized authentic leadership when they witnessed it. The standing ovation wasn't merely approval. It was recognition. In an era where celebrity often trumps substance, Caroline had demonstrated how measured humility, coupled with unwavering conviction, could reset the entire conversation. "We build our nation's strength not through division," she concluded as the applause continued, "but through honoring commitments made to each other. That's true whether you wear a uniform, support someone who does, or simply respect the values that service represents." As Caroline stepped back from the podium, she had accomplished something remarkable. She had transformed what began as personal defense into a moment of national reflection. The conflict that started with a celebrity's mockery had evolved into a powerful reminder of what truly matters. Daniel met her at the stairs, their embrace saying everything words couldn't. No cameras could capture what passed between them, the private understanding of two people who had watched integrity prevail not through force, but through persistent truth. Sometimes, observed a retired general nearby, the most decisive victories are won not by those who shout the loudest, but by those who stand the firmest. In Washington's endless cycle of scandals and scoring points, Caroline Levit had demonstrated something revolutionary: leadership defined not by domination, but by unwavering commitment to honor. She had not defeated Tom Cruz so much as she had rendered him irrelevant to the larger truths at stake, and that, perhaps, was the most powerful resolution of all. In a world where celebrity often overshadows substance, Caroline and Daniel's story reminds us that true leadership is born of courage and unwavering commitment to values, not flash or fame. When confronted with mockery and power plays, standing firm with dignity and evidence can rewrite narratives and inspire a collective call for respect, proving that honor and truth, once unleashed, are forces no spotlight can dim.